Good morning, everybody. I'm Muriel Bowser, the Mayor of Washington, D.C. We are located in Dunbar Senior High School in Washington, D.C., and I am joined by members of my public education team and my public safety team. We just concluded a meeting with school leaders, school principals in both D.C. public schools and the D.C. public charter schools to talk about our young people and what schools and how schools are working with young people in the entire government to keep kids safe. We talked about how especially we can stay connected, government, the whole of government, with school leaders, tools that are currently available or new tools that they need, policies that they think will help them do their jobs in keeping kids safe. We left the meeting with a commitment to follow up on all of the major issues brought up, and more than that, to have continued and regular conversations. Let me just ask our chancellor if he just wants to speak on behalf of the educators.
Thank you, Mayor Bowser. So I think today was extremely helpful in that oftentimes there are conversations among school leaders in their networks, but this was a citywide conversation. I think it's a conversation, as we heard today, is long overdue, and we're excited that we have some next steps. I do want to commend our school leaders, our education team, that DC schools, DC public schools continue to be a first choice for our families. And our school leaders are thinking about every resource possible to continue to keep our students safe while they're on campus, but also how we can connect with the community in a collective response to some of the challenges we've experienced most recently. So I'm very hopeful about our next steps and thrilled that we had the opportunity to have this discussion today, and greatly appreciate the participation from our school leaders.
Okay, questions?
You mentioned that you wanted to address those and you're going to touch base on them, but what were the concerns that were brought up today?
Well, there were a number, and some of them involved having public safety officials in the building, specifically school resource officers, and how not having school resource officers is affecting the school climate. There was also a discussion around communications and how school officials can communicate with public safety officials or other parts of the government and do that more effectively to make sure that they're better serving kids. They also want support with discipline and discipline procedures, especially the ones that have changed in the building. There's a big discussion on how we can hear from kids and how the impacts of social media and music that are affecting our kids. We also had a discussion about how our staff is doing, how our principals are doing. And given that they all have been under incredible stress bringing schools back from COVID, and some of them, too many of them, have directly experienced the impacts of gun violence on their school community directly. Questions? Okay. Yep.
You need something that will change as a result of the meeting today.
Well, I do want to convene so that we can do a debrief on what's happening. But I can tell you that our discussion as a city on officers for school resource officers has to be a priority. How we are making sure that everybody knows, all the school leaders know how to communicate and get the help that they need in acute and long-term safety situations is a must. And I can tell you we will convene this group of very important leaders in our community more regularly. You've heard me say and I don't mean this in a way that's in any way disparaging, but they're like mayors because they are responsible for a physical location and their campuses. They're responsible for adults, children. They're responsible for buildings, programs, and they are responsible for outcomes. And they have constituents, and sometimes that are very high need and vocal, and sometimes they have to drag information out of their constituents. So they are very, very important leaders in our community. And I will say that we rigorously recruit them and train them. So we have very high confidence in their leadership abilities across all 8 wards. Yep.
Who's in this meeting? I mean, we see who you're backed up by, but who were the school leaders, the stakeholders?
We invited all of our secondary schools, middle schools, and high schools in both sectors, DC public schools and the public charter schools. And some of them had staff that joined them.
No parents, these were all...
No, these were all school leaders. Yes, Sam.
Are there resource officers in the schools still, or are they not there?
There's some, and by law, they are diminishing. And I don't know if somebody has on the top. Do you know off the top how many? Yeah. Chief Wheeler Taylor.
The direct question would be by 2020. I'm Assistant Chief Pamela Wheeler Taylor, Assistant Chief of the Youth and Family Engagement Bureau, which is comprised of both the School Safety Division and Youth and Family Services Division. We do have school resource officers, but by law, by 2025, the School Safety Division will be abolished to 0.
So you will not have DC police in the schools at all?
Not the Metropolitan Police Department. We do have a triangle of safety, public safety officials, including DCPS Armed School Security, DCPS security guards, and also special police officers.
So I don't know if it's a policy question I should be asking, but what do you think of this? I mean, I know this has come up before. Okay, Mayor. Yeah. I mean, having been at certain schools in D.C.
Well, Sam, you may remember it has been somewhat debated. And when I say somewhat, I believe, and someone will correct me if I'm wrong, this law originally changed during a budget. Am I right? So it wasn't a standalone piece of legislation that had its own path, that had a hearing, that had a debate, and it went into effect. And that was rolling back a program that from hearing from school leaders, they think is effective.
So you're pushing back on this, Mayor? I mean, are you trying to get these officers to stay in the schools? What's the situation?
We're gonna keep working on the issue, Sam. We're gonna keep working on it. Yep.
I'm wondering if there's a conversation about keeping kids safe when they're coming to and from school, and if SROs are on their way out, as it is right now, does that mean that MPD or you're planning on stepping up enforcement around the schools to sort of buffer it, maybe?
Well, we have a program. We have 2 programs that we discussed with school leaders today, and I'm going to ask Deputy Mayor Kine to talk specifically about our Safe Passage program and our DC School Connect program.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm Paul Kine, the Deputy Mayor for Education, and we have stood up 2 programs directly in response to what we have heard in prior years from school leaders and educators. One is called Safe Passage, Safe Blocks. And this is an evidence-based program where we grant fund to community-based organizations to hire trained, skilled community members to basically be on the streets at drop-off and dismissal time for students. So we currently have over 160 adults who are helping keep our kids safe during their transit times, who are associated with 52 of schools in our highest priority neighborhoods. So that's our Safe Passage program. And we had a good discussion with the principals about that and its effectiveness and things that we can do to make some improvements there. Secondly, we have a transportation program, which we call DC School Connect. And this also is in our 2 highest priority neighborhoods for safety. And this currently helps 300 students get to and from school without using public transportation. And these are students that have been identified by their schools as needing this additional safety measure. There are buses that make loops from the school to 2 or 3 dedicated drop-off locations that are convenient to where those students live.
Needing additional help, like as a student.
These are basically situations where the school community, the school leaders or teachers in the school building understand that those students can't just go to the metro stop, that they are involved in some kind of conflict or at some kind of risk, and so they're identified in that way.
Just to give some context to the SROs, I'm Kevin Donahue, City Administrator, there are currently about 60 SROs. At their height, there was about 113 SROs, including supervisors. And then, as the Assistant Chief mentioned, they're by law required to be drawn down to 0 if the law doesn't change. So the context is that the principals in the room have already felt the impact of a drawback of SROs, cutting it roughly in half. And that was, I think, part of the anxiety they have as they've seen the impact. They know it, and now they'll see the impact being drawn down to 0 if it doesn't change.
I think one of the biggest, and it's going to be difficult to boil down the whole discussion, but this is one feeling that I got, is that the SROs were their main point of giving information and getting information around safety, and they felt very confident in the SRO's ability to scan the environment and know the environment that was affecting their kids in their school community. And absent that, they're having to figure it out on their own. Yeah.
And yesterday, Chief Conti seemed to be extremely angry too with what's going on in the community with people that seem to be wanting blood, basically. Do you have a concern about the level of anger in that community and that people might try and take the law into their own hands? And how do you bring the temperature down over this case?
It's a horrible situation. And we have a 13-year-old that died, and we don't have all of the facts. And the people who are responsible for gathering the facts and making charging decisions are doing it just as fast as possible. And so that is the very uncomfortable place we're at, but it is also the necessary place to get to just decisions.
Follow up. Some of the most controversial shootings that have taken place, or crimes that have taken place in the city, have been decided by a grand jury. Yesterday, Chief Conti seemed to indicate that this case was going to go that way. I mean, the police have the ability to take a probable cause warrant and make an arrest. Do you support the grand jury angle here?
Those are decisions that the U.S. Attorney makes. And so it is. They have to look at the set of facts and make the best decision. And what's important is that justice is served. And unfortunately, that's not always fast. But that is, I think, the most important thing. Yes.
I'm sorry. On following up to Paul's question, though, can you relate to the community's frustration?
Of course I can.
How is this, in your opinion, different to you?
How is what different?
This case, the outrage going on in this situation, how is this all different to you?
I think the outrage, I think it will feel different for different people, but what makes me so sick is that we have a 13-year-old that was at middle school on Thursday and Friday, and by the weekend he was dead. And sadly, it's not that different from other young people who have been killed in our city. And we know who pulled the trigger in this case. We don't always know who pulled the trigger, and in many of the cases where a young person dies, it's another young person that did the shooting. So what's the same is that we have a young person that should be alive.
Mayor Bowser, yesterday there was another death by suicide off of the Taft Bridge. DDOT was in the process of assessing that bridge after the previous suicide earlier or later last year. And they have now said that they plan to put a suicide barrier up there on Taft Bridge and are looking at 2 other bridges, but they say it's dependent on funding. So my question to you about this is just funding. Will you find funding this year for the suicide prevention barrier at Taft? Will this have to go to next year's budget? What can we expect as far as a timeline now that your administration is committed to doing it?
I think it's more than that. I think it's planning to get it done and working with all of the agencies that are necessary to make a change to a historic structure or a significant structure in the city. So I think it's bigger than a staffing than a funding question. But more largely, Mark, it is, we want people to know that all of the resources in our city where help is, where they can get help. And we want to encourage people to reach out. We have a mental health hotline. It's a new number, 911, not 911, 988, sorry, thank you. 988, that if you dial can connect you to mental health resources, and we hope people will do that.
Statement, they say that all the stakeholders, both federal and local, are on board with doing this, but it is dependent on funding, and the funding would come from the city, from you and the council. So I'm just asking, will you find the money this year?
Let me just be clear. If I directed the agency to do something, I always fund it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to Safe Passage. What did you hear from the school leaders about its effectiveness, and what do they identify as areas for improvement?
A couple of things I will say about it. This is something that I experience with a lot of our programs, is that not everybody knows about it. So frequently I will take the opportunity just to explain what it is. And then some days following this, the chancellor and others are going to get questions like, how can I get involved, and how can we get our school community involved? I will tell you one thing that I posited to the school leaders is if we should have more of our violence interrupters actually in the building, like the very successful program that we have at Anacostia, which is the ONE's Leadership Academy. And the questions that I think we all have to address around how do we get more people being able to participate in those programs because they have clearances and they have been properly trained and they have gained the confidence of the principal. Yes.
Beatrice Peterson, ABC News. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on concealed carry? And do you think in the wake of the death of Karan, should that change in any way?
Listen, we have a storied history about local control of our gun laws in the city. Everybody knows. I think there are too many guns, too many illegal ones, and too many legal ones. That's how I feel. That is not what the courts say is compliant with the Second Amendment. And so therefore, we have to exert as much local control over registration and training as possible. And we think that we have landed in a way that is legal. Yes.
Two questions, if I may. Do you agree with the chief still not identifying the shooter when we know in other criminal cases, maybe a witness or a victim of a crime is also identified in the police report?
I agree with all of the chief's comments.
And then a follow-up to that, if I may. The Ward 5 council member, he formally requested that you release the body cam video to any officers who responded to the scene that day, saying that you can do so on a case-by-case basis in matters of public interest under a certain D.C. code section. Are you going to respond to that? Will you do so?
Well, I think actually the code is silent in cases like this, where the council has written pretty specific languages around police-involved shootings. This is not a police-involved shooting. However, I regard my responsibility to make sure the public has as much information as I can give that won't prohibit justice being served. And in this case, we don't have body-worn camera that shows the shooting. We only have body-worn camera that shows the response. We have consulted with the parties that are our criminal justice partners, and I have to agree that I think it will not or it could prohibit how the investigation proceeds. So as of right now, we won't be releasing it.
How that could prohibit how the investigation proceeds?
I would leave that to police officials and to the United States Attorney. Yep.
The shooter, a D.C. government employee. I've seen that somewhere.
Yes.
The shooter is.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm not going to say what agency. I can tell you the employee, like in other cases where we've had an employee accused or charged, that employee is on administrative leave.
Do with public safety? Is this employee in the public safety? We asked if he was a police officer. He's not in public safety.
No.
But he is on administrative leave right now in the city government?
Yes.
Do you know him?
I don't. I believe so. Thank you.